Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to attempt to speak to the pros and cons of regulation. As noted in a previous podcast that's been up, I was at the OIA, or the Osteopathic International Alliance Conference, that was put on by the Ontario Association of Osteopathic Manual Practitioners, and there was a good amount of people, practitioners, regulators from a variety of places in the world that are involved with the OIA. And obviously, within the Canadian context, New Brunswick has the college, I don't know the acronym properly, but essentially regulatory college for osteopathic manual practitioners. So this, by some, is seen as the first in a set of dominoes to fall. By others, they see it as a sign of things that they do not want. I just want to take some time to attempt to provide some considerations. So, as I noted in a previous podcast, or a previous edition of this, that some of the things I heard being said in support of regulation is that it would stabilize scope of practice. It would allow for scope of practice to not be lost. And fair enough. So there would be, and also some people suggested, so this is in the positive direction, or I would say in the hopeful direction, because there isn't necessarily proof that this would be the case, that there could be an expansion of the scope of practice. With expansion of scope of practice, you would be considering things like protected acts. You would be considering things like things outside of hands-on manual osteopathy. So those are hopeful, those are positive, they are protective to practitioners. So the argument would be that they would be protective to practitioners. So if you stabilize or expand scope of practice, or you don't lose scope of practice, it's considering that you would be protecting the practitioner and their ability to practice in the way that they prefer at the moment. Fair enough. One of the things that should be considered in however this ends up rolling out is that in order for a regulatory college to be set up, you must at the base level be considered a danger to the public without regulatory control. So the underlying assumption of a regulatory college is that healthcare practitioners have the opportunity, or without proper regulation, are dangerous to the public. So I want to be as clear as I can with this. I cannot argue in good faith that a government agency would just think that all healthcare practitioners are dangerous. I think the underlying assumption may be more cleanly said that there is the possibility for danger to the public with healthcare practice if the person is not appropriately trained to identify things. Okay, so the root assumption of any form of regulatory college is that there is danger present to the public. So the public must be protected from you as a practitioner. In order to do that, you have to have limits on your behavior. The most important limits to your behavior are clinical limits to your behavior. So a scope of practice has to be set such that anything outside of that, and you will be in danger of losing your license because you're posing a danger to the public due to your believed inability to perform anything outside of the strictly defined scope. So you have to set up a scope of practice, so limits, top, bottom, left, right, some form of limitation to behavior in relation to the general public. The assumptions carried with that are based on assumed knowledge and assumed skill. And the reason I say assumed is because people can pass tests and not actually have the appropriate level of knowledge or skill. In my health science education master's, one of the things that seemed consistent to me is that the primary concern of a regulator is a sociopath. So somebody who can perform, maybe that's somebody who's going to have some negative interaction with the public just because of their general personality. So the challenge with finding a sociopath is that they're often highly skilled and highly knowledgeable. So current regulatory frameworks don't seem to do anything to finding the people that the regulators are most afraid of. because they are going to be dangerous to the public because they'll have time and access in order to behave negatively towards the public and do so outside the scope of practice. So to get back to it, you need to set regulations, you need to set boundaries for behavior, and then you need to have some form of protective mechanism. There's some form of, some form of, and I want to try to find the right word, because there's, the term that's coming most to my mind is some term of punitive method, and it's not necessarily the case, but it's more so some form of investigatory method in order to figure out if punishment should be applied or punishment should not be applied, right? So there is a degree to which the regulatory body is responsible for policing the practitioners that are subject to it. Okay, so we need the baseline assumption that danger is possible to the public from a practitioner. We need a framework of behavior, so edges to behavior in relation to the public that would be set by scope of practice, and then we need some form of, again, the term may sound harsh, but some form of policing mechanism, so some form of investigation and punishment mechanism. The challenge with the investigation and punishment mechanism is generally that while the regulatory bodies are built to protect the public from the practitioner, in a technical sense, because they are responsible for the policing function, the regulatory bodies technically can protect the practitioner from the government. So the punishment, the investigation and punishment function of the regulatory bodies means that it is not done by the judicial system or by the legal system. Obviously, there's a proper relationship there, but generally speaking, the professional misconduct is handled by the colleges, and it is kept away generally, not exclusively, but generally from the legal system. So there is a bit of a dicey thing there. Again, just trying to get this out there so that these concepts have the opportunity to be considered and heard, and then you can do what you like from there with respect to what you think of the things that I'm saying. So we have the base assumption that there is possible danger from practitioner to public. We have a scope of practice which sets limits to behavior. We then have a police function, essentially an investigation and punishment function. The thing about the investigation and punishment function is that the college sets up those things that you can be punished for. Now, in a generally positive sense, the majority of what regulatory colleges are going to look at is going to be your clinical behavior or your non-clinical behavior between yourself and a patient. So somebody who presents for care, you provide the care within your scope of practice. However, you then have an interaction with them that is unethical and outside of your scope of practice. So there's the possibility that in the appropriate giving of care, there can be something else inappropriate because you have time and access, often in a difficult to observe setting, so behind a closed door, and that position of safety and that position of privilege can be abused. So you can provide appropriate clinical care and inappropriate social interaction, maybe the best way to say that. Then you run into the challenge that because the colleges set the behavioral guidelines for the practitioner, they can make the argument that your non-clinical public behavior can be considered outside of your scope of practice. And that's not really a clean way to say that. More so that you can behave publicly in a way that is considered unbecoming of your profession, whether or not there's a clinical element. So you can make public statements that your college can punish you for because they can argue that it is ethically unbecoming or professionally unbecoming. They wouldn't call it professional misconduct, but your public-facing facade, if it does not line up with the ideas that they support, then it is possible that you can be punished for that. So you want to be aware that there are some instances whereby regulatory colleges have seen things that are non-clinical presented on, say, private accounts, private social media accounts, that have been considered negative, and there has been maybe circuitous or say in a roundabout way, things that I have seen people face pressure or punishment for. So I have personal examples, and I don't really want to speak to them, only on account of the fact that I would prefer to keep some people's details in relation to myself more on the private side. But I have seen things that would be, I've seen people outside of their clinical practice attempting to promote things and have problems as a result of that. Essentially, as far as I'm aware, all healthcare practitioners or all regulated healthcare practitioners within Canada are not allowed to use testimonials in any form of advertising for their clinical practice. However, I've seen that extended to non-clinical businesses or businesses that may be considered in the gray. Now, if the business is in a gray area, I understand it a little bit more. But if you're using testimonials and you're using your title in any way, so the moment you use your title or you note that you have an accreditation that is subject to a regulatory college, now all of a sudden those regulatory college rules apply. So if you were trying to make a political statement for some reason, and there was any acknowledgement where you were sharing that political statement that you were a professional that's subject to a regulatory body, so you tried to use your title, you're gonna be in some possible hot water, especially if that political idea lines up less with the regulatory college's preferred ideas. Or maybe they just don't want you talking about politics at all in either direction. At least if it's in either direction on the political spectrum, if they don't want any of it, then that seems more baseline fair. But then the question is, do you have the ability to share your personal opinion in public once you have a title that is related to a regulatory body? And it's a question. It's not a definitive answer. But I have seen more than one example where people have expressed themselves in their non-clinical setting and have some issues as a result of that in relation to the regulatory college. So one can make the argument that a regulatory college has the ability to limit the freedom of expression of somebody who is a professional who is subject to that regulatory college if they are expressing things in the public view, non-clinically, that are not lining up with that regulatory college. So I apologize for using somewhat obscure language here. I'm trying to make an argument in good faith, or bring up a concept in good faith, it's probably more accurate, without pinning things down. I just want to have these thoughts out there to be considered, that there are some fundamental assumptions that come with regulatory colleges and regulatory apparatuses that, while often initiated in good faith, have the ability to negatively impact a professional's ability to be a human being outside of that profession. So if you're a physician, if you're a massage therapist, if you're a chiropractor, if you're a physiotherapist, if you're an occupational therapist, if you're a naturopathic physician, naturopathic doctor, depending on how your regulatory body is functioning, you can have uneven application of regulatory pressure due to your personal expression outside of your professional role. It does exist. It may be unethical and inappropriate. However, because the regulatory college is in charge of investigation and punishment, they are allowed to do that to those practitioners, or they carry the ability to at least make the attempt to do that. And one can consider that positive, depending on the individual circumstances that we're talking about, or we could talk about. One can consider that negative. I'm simply saying you should be aware that that is a possibility. So if you happen to be an osteopathic manual practitioner who is against regulation, then you would be concerned about the ability to be told what to do to limit your scope. If you are an osteopathic practitioner who is in favor of regulation, you likely think it's a good idea to limit what some practitioners do, because you may know some practitioners that you think get a little fast and loose with how they approach patient care. If you are against regulation in osteopathic manual therapy, then maybe you're concerned that you could have your freedom of expression limited. If you are in favor of regulating osteopathic manual therapy in Canada, in the rest of the provinces outside of New Brunswick, maybe you're less concerned with your freedom of expression being limited because you consider it a meaningful trade-off. So it's a pros and cons deal. There are trade-offs. It's a question of the trade-offs you are willing to accept. I just want to be part of the attempt to make people aware of the trade-offs that might be in your future if you happen to be an osteopathic manual practitioner. So hopefully you learned something. Thank you for sticking around this long, and we'll talk again soon.